So in this case, you know, I've seen people where they have, let's say these kind of objects are combined. These two objects are combined. So again, common things I see that maybe are wasteful. One thing would be, oops, let me just make sure these are combined. So what you can do, I would say any polys that are kind of invisible to the camera and will never be seen, right? Like these side faces, I would delete these for sure. So that's the sort of thing you need to kind of think about. It's one of those first things I tend to consider is, will I ever see these faces? If not, will I ever see them? If not, delete them, right? They're just going to waste texture space. Polygon resources will be wasted. That's number one. So a lot of times too, when people unwrap, I'm just going to do an automatic on these, which is going to be fairly quick, like so. And they're already stacked. All right, checkers look fine. And then we have a separate mesh. So sometimes you can keep your mesh separate when you're editing the mesh and doing UVs. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, I'll just do automatic on this, which is, again, should be fine. Do a layout. So there's nothing wrong with keeping your mesh separate. Generally speaking, though, when I'm modeling, I tend to combine the mesh directly at a certain point, whether it's early on or later on in the process. For me, it's usually somewhat early on. And usually by the end, when I've got a single mesh, if it's not animatable, but it's considered kind of one prop or one asset, I would tend to combine it. So what you can do, right, if the UVs are overlapping like this, when you combine the mesh, they're still technically going to overlap. But you can do one of a couple things, which is very interesting. You can take all the shells and lay them out so they each get their own little space, right? So I'm going to let this thing lay out. I've got a complete layout. But what you could do in theory, this is really, really interesting. What you could do in theory is keep the object together and then take your respective UVs. So let me show you this. This is under the UV toolkit. Again, I usually like to have this thing docked. I believe it's under transform. You have this thing called move, and you can move it one whole UV tile. So the basic idea is this, is that this central tile is where you do your UV layouts, your unfolds. That's where you do your work. And when it's done, so let's say those side rails for the stairs are done, you can offset them. So any texture that you wind up seeing in your scene, and you can see the UV space, it says 1001, 1002. If I move it down, it's UV2-1. And there's different, these are basically called UDIMs, and it goes 1001, 2, 1002, 2, right? So we can actually have one unwrap that acts as multiple unwraps for a single mesh, or for multiple components. So you might say, I want a ton of high-res texture in this metal component if this is metal, and I want a ton of wood texture in here. So the UVs will still apply, right? So we take all our shells. So if you still want to work on another part or add something else to this, you can offset that and stick another texture in. What technically will happen is if you apply a wood texture, it will actually infinitely repeat into all these squares. So this single square essentially is like your active workspace, but if you offset it, it's still treating it exactly the same way as if it were in this spot. So what's great about this is that you can say, okay, on those stairs, I'm going to assign a blin. And just temporarily, if you want, you can say, okay, this will be hot pink. And then if I go to the faces, I can select these pieces. And I'm going to say, let's assign another blin. And we'll make that bright green. Now, doesn't look like much, right? So I'm just going to quickly grab a wood texture and then maybe like a metal texture, okay? Again, we have our own libraries that are far better than this stuff, but yeah, whatever. I'll just grab something like this. Save image. Oh, it's not the right format, so I'm going to grab something else. Sorry, save image. Wood. Okay. And then scratched metal. All right, so again, I should find a high-res image or whatever, but anyways, we're just going to use this as an example. Metal. Okay, so right on that, if you delete your history, you'll see there's now 2 blends assigned, right? So I know I want the metal in this green thing. I'll go to File and load the metal texture. It should be somewhere in here. If I hit 6, we'll see that texture, complete with its watermarks. And if I go to the other blend, right, and then throw in that texture for this, which should just be wood, right? There's our wood texture. So you can actually really have one object with floating mesh, right, and have different offsets. So if you take a look, essentially what's happening is that wood texture is repeating into the space. I don't exactly remember where the option is. You can actually tell it to repeat its visibility. I think it might be somewhere to view or image, but yeah, maybe display, image range. Yeah, I don't know if we can. There. So you can sort of see it, right? Technically what's happening is that same working space is just duplicated over and over again. So what's great about this is that you can actually, here we can do like 2 by 2 by 2. Let's go 2. I don't know, we'll try it this way, but okay. Right? So wherever you offset, right, that texture, it'll fit that in there. So the same thing would be happening essentially with the metal as well, right? So the idea is that you're assigning the material to the polygons where you want it assigned, but you can actually have one UV that actually acts kind of like 2 separate UVs on one object, right? So you can have separate objects that share a UV space. You can have individual objects that have their own UVs, or you can have one combined object that still acts like it has multiple UVs. So there's a lot of kind of interesting ways in which you can sort of hack and edit your UVs together. This is a very common thing where you have shells like this and they're basically offset. So if you're ever going into professional production, there's something known as UDIMs. So that idea of numbering and labeling things is like 1001, 1002, UDIM texture. There we go. And there's some really great videos, by the way. This is another good group here, Flip Normals, who really talks about this quite a bit. But the idea is that, you know, you could have a single character where the face fills one UV space and then you offset it. Then you just do the other bits of flesh, then just the clothing or just one piece of clothing, right? So you can actually kind of offset different sections of a character into their own UV space and then apply their own unique texture. In major feature film productions, this will often happen. So a lot of times you'll hear on like a ZBrush video or something, they'll say, oh, we took this character and split it into 24K or 8K texture maps. So that literally means they just almost took every single UV shell or split it into specific sections so they could put a lot more texture, a lot more pixels onto the whole mesh. Because ultimately at some point you can't load more than I think a 16,000 pixel square image into one texture spot currently. So this is kind of the way they're labeled as UDIMs. So you go from U, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 at the last number. The second digit is going up or down vertically, right? So 1011, 1012. So this is how UDIMs basically work. I think now Substance Painter supports it. ZBrush supports this as well. So you can import mesh, have your UV set up this way, and actually still organize your textures and output this way as well. Substance Painter doesn't support UDIMs, eh? This is why it hasn't taken over film yet. It's slowly making its way in, but yeah. So to be a serious feature film software, it needs to support UDIMs. But games actually currently don't technically use UDIMs because they usually try to pack one texture in for one character mesh or one texture in for one prop, let's say, right? So that would be a limitation. But anyways, this is kind of a very basic introduction into how you can work with UVs. Like I said, you can pack them in together even. So even if these things are packed in together, right, what's going to happen is this will use way less of the metal texture space, and this will use a little bit less of the wood texture space when they get laid in. But they're still applied. So you'll see how the efficiency can change right? So they can still be packed in, but I'm still applying the same surface to each part. Still technically applying respectively to each mesh, but you're actually only now using, right? If I isolate this, I'm using a little bit less of that metal texture. So you're actually wasting, in some cases, those textures. Now, if you were to merge it as one map, right, instead of applying it separately, then you'd have to go into Photoshop and say, okay, well, in those areas, I have to leave the metal there, right? And then in the other areas of this map where the steps are, so in this area is where I'd have to isolate the wood texture, right? So there's a few different ways you can kind of combine and mix and match texture. But when you want to use as many of the pixels of your textures as possible, then you'd actually maximize your layout for just the wood pieces or just the metal pieces and offset them. Okay, so I just want to give you guys a little bit of insight into that, because that is a bit more of an advanced texture and UV workflow, but it can work quite well to give you more pixel density, which means more resolution, more quality out of your projects.